If it is not possible to see the divine nature with eyes of flesh, it is possible to gain an image of the divine power of the Creator from his works. So says Cyril of Jerusalem, riffing on the wisdom of Solomon. And he goes on. Solomon, he quotes him as saying, says this: in fact, one knows the author by analogy from the greatness and beauty of creatures. He does not say simply that one knows the author from creatures, but adds by analogy. The more we consider his creatures in a contemplative way, in fact, the more God will show himself to be great. But let's consider this from another angle. St. Augustine says this: if they were capable of sufficient knowledge to account for the universe, how is it that they did not more easily find its Lord? They are blamed for having spent their time, their activity, and their discussions scrutinizing and in a certain way measuring what is created. They investigated the movements of planets, the distance between stars, the courses of heavenly bodies. What ability, what capacity! But when they were at a point of seeking to know the Creator, who was not far from them, they were unable to find him. And that is the dilemma that people find themselves in now. We'll hear more in the Wisdom of Solomon coming up next. I'm Joel Miller.
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy.
Today on Bad Books of the Bible, we're looking at the Wisdom of Solomon, chapters 13 through 14. I wonder, Jamie, if you could recap for us what we have seen so far, particularly in chapters 11 and 12.
Yeah, there's really a lot here, so I won't take up too much time, but it's covering a lot of stuff about God's patience with humanity, and really even his patience with the worst of the worst in our world. St. Clement of Rome, commenting on Wisdom 12 in his letter to the Corinthians, he comments this. He says, he brought all things into being by the immense power of his word, and with a single word he could make them all disappear. Who can ask of him, what have you done? Who can withstand his great power? He does everything when and as he wants. Nothing that he does is done in vain. He sees all things, and nothing lies beyond his will. So we get this message from 11 and 12 that God provides for his people, that his providence makes its way kind of into the nooks and crannies of history. His providence isn't only in the nice things. It's not just for the lovers of wisdom, the lovers of God. It's also for those who choose wickedness and folly. And his providence includes punishment, includes justice. But even then, as we were talking about previously, it's not without hope.
Right.
Because even the book of wisdom says this of God. He said in chapter 11, it says, but you have mercy on all because you can do all things. You overlook people's sins so that they might repent. For you love everything that exists. You hate none of the things you've made, for you would not have made anything you hated. So I think that kind of sums up where we are and where God's role is in this world as we experience it.
So he's striving with humanity, and part of that striving is dealing with humans that reject him. And at the end of 12, It talks about one of the ways humans do this. We do it through idolatry. And that's really what 13 and 14 are all about. The book shifts at this point to what biblical scholars would call an excursus on idolatry, which is to say, in more like Dennis Miller language, a rant. If anyone's familiar with Dennis Miller's formerly great comedic career, he would have called that a rant. And that's what the author is doing here. He's going off on a rant about idolatry.
Yeah, and his rant, isn't just Dennis Miller style, right? This is a long tradition, even prior to Dennis Miller. So he's stepping into a world in which it's both critique and exposition. So, it's definitely Hebraic, like it's from God's people, from the Hebrews, from the Jews.
It's echoed right there in like Isaiah, right? This kind of screed that he's on comes right out of Isaiah.
That's exactly it. So, basically you have this critique of idolatry, and you also have this simultaneous thing that God can be known through His
Hmm.
creation, which we'll get into today.
Yeah.
And this is both in Hebrew and kind of Greek thinking. And so, even one of the things that I think we'll unpack a little bit today is like this Greek idea that the imperfect beauty of natural objects in contrast to the supreme and perfect ideal that is God. Like that speaks to the Greeks, possibly even more than it speaks to the Hebrews. So we see the author of Wisdom here bringing in this classic complaint, but also making it like a positive case for something as well.
I think that's really important because of the way he handles this. In fact, you can see the tension that he's playing with right there. When he talks about worshiping nature, which is to say, trying to find God through the creation and at the same time missing it, like falling
Sure.
short,
Yeah.
he says, these people are little to be blamed. Now he comes back and he unsays what he says. So we'll hit that in a few minutes too. But what's interesting there is it's like he recognizing that they're close.
Right.
There's a band named Eden Burning who had a song forever ago in which one of the lines in the song, I think it was the chorus, says, "You're nearer than you'll ever know."
Mm,
And that, I mean, that comes right out of this book too. But
yeah.
the whole idea there is that we find God reflected in nature if we're there looking for it. And that's exactly what Cyril of Jerusalem said. It's what Augustine said. And what Augustine pointed out was they missed.
Yeah.
But how did they miss? The author of The Wisdom of Solomon points out two primary ways in which humans miss, in which they come short. And it really comes down to, on the one hand, nature worship, and
Hmm.
on the other hand, graven images. And the author kind of holds up one as slightly better than the other, but they both miss the mark.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I think it's notable that here in the first verse of chapter 13, he basically says that all men are ignorant of God, kind of like naturally we just miss the boat on this.
Right.
And it's in front of us, but left to our own devices, we're likely to miss it. And I thought was really cool. He sets up who he really understands as God already in this first verse, in contrast to the idols, because he says they were unable from the good things that are seen to know him who exists.
Mm-hmm.
And this phrase, him who exists, really comes back from the name of God revealed to Moses.
I am
Him
that
who
I am.
exists, I am that I am. I'm he who is,
Right.
and as Christians, we apply that even to Christ. We even see that in our Orthodox icons. He who is what we inscribe around Christ in the nimbus around his head, or some people might call it a halo, right?
Right.
Um,
Yep.
we put him there as the one who's revealed himself to Moses. And so it becomes very clear very quickly who we're talking about. And that is in contrast to the idols that we're going to get into later in the text.
So let's start with nature worship. It's sort of like here the author is providing an anthropology of false worship, and this is kind of where he starts. He talks about humans mistaking the forces of nature or the beauty of nature for
Hmm.
its maker.
Hmm.
And you could see how this would make sense. It says here, these people are little to be blamed, for perhaps they go astray while seeking God and desiring to find him. It's like there's power, there's majesty, there are unexplainable forces in nature, and humans kind of latch hold of that as something
Hmm.
somehow transcendent and then identify it as God.
Yeah, no, that's true. I thought it was really interesting that the Jewish annotated apocrypha said there are Jewish legends about Abraham,
Mm-hmm.
and it said that he actually like inferred the existence of God by looking at nature and then looking at the idols and being like, that is obviously misdirected enthusiasm. That's folly
Huh.
right there.
Wow.
Now, I don't know much about those legends. I would love to tease that out, but we would say similar things. I mean, Saint Cyril of Jerusalem says that if it is not possible to see the divine nature with eyes of flesh, it is possible to gain an image of the divine power of the creator from his works.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to see God, but not through the idolatry. Saint Didymus the Blind put it this way. He said, God has a face that shows itself through his creatures. And
Which
so
is an incredible statement.
it is. You can put that on a bumper sticker, but you really, we have to be careful that we're not exchanging the creation for the creator.
Right. Well, and that exchange is why he says that they are, like little to be blamed, but then he kind of walks it back. He says shortly after that, yet again, not even they are to be excused. And what's fascinating about this, and you can already hear it in some of the words chosen as we're talking here, some of the words that we've already expressed, but this is picked up almost exactly in Romans chapter 1 and elsewhere in Romans. Bruce Metzger actually puts these passages from Romans and the Wisdom of Solomon in parallel columns so you can see it. You can see the argument. Yeah. And it's Paul from chapter 1, verse 20, 21, 22, 26, 29. He follows Paul's outline, and then he goes back and he shows you the parallel passages in the book of Wisdom. And you can see things like this. Chapter 13, verse 8, right out of Wisdom, talks about there being no excuse for this. Well, that is exactly what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verse 20. They are without excuse. And this idea that the power of God, the identity of God is visible in nature, and yet people can't see it, is something that you would imagine, well, maybe they're just incapable. But Paul's saying, no, like they are capable. And if they are capable, then there is no excuse if they don't. And that's exactly what Wisdom is saying here also. And some of the language is very parallel and very interesting. You already mentioned the first verse where it talks about all men who were ignorant of God. It's the same word that Paul uses in verse 21 of chapter 1, where it refers to their senseless minds were darkened. This is like the same language being used. And it just goes on from there. There's this idea that God is revealing himself. The curtain is pulled back. If you're just looking, you can find it, and yet we don't.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting too, the parallel when he talks about the idols themselves. He's in verse 10 of Wisdom, chapter 13. He says they give the name of gods to the works of human hands, gold and silver fashioned with skill, likeness of animals or useless stone, the work of an ancient hand. He's like layering on these possibilities. St. Paul does the same thing. He says they exchange the glory of the immortal God for an image resembling mortal human beings or birds or four-footed animals or reptiles. I mean, it's the same song. It's just in a different key.
Right. That's fascinating. And it shows that Paul was not only aware of this book, but felt great using it. Yeah. Because I think you'd be hard pressed to say that Paul's language was not reliant to some degree or another on the Wisdom of Solomon. It is, the connections are pretty obvious, and one preceded the other. Therefore, it's pretty obvious that Paul had read this and was using it.
It's interesting. I stumbled across a book, haven't read it yet. Very expensive, but it's called God, Grace, and Righteousness in Wisdom of Solomon and Paul. And it's written by a Protestant Reformed professor, and he basically places Paul and wisdom in conversation. And even though I don't have a copy of the book, I was able to track down a review that says specifically, he basically does the same thing we're doing here. He lays out Paul's argument in Romans 1 through 2, with the argument in Romans 13 through 14, with essentially a comparison and contrast of their rhetoric and, the polemics against idolatry, the stuff it says about immortality, about divine justice and grace. He basically says, all of that is more or less in harmony. Now, I haven't read the book, so maybe he takes a left turn somewhere and ultimately ends up with more of a contrast, but it's clear that there is a conversation here at the very least. And I think it would be hard pressed to imagine that Paul did not have wisdom in mind when he wrote his letter.
Well, to preempt the conclusion that neither one of us have yet from not having read this book, I think even if the author were to find and take issue with parts of the wisdom of Solomon, it's worth remembering that a book says what it says, and it says something else, which is what we say it says. Like, those two things are
Sure,
important. In other words, the interpretation of a book matters just as much as what the book actually says. And the way
sure.
the church fathers use this book, they are actually putting, Paul and the wisdom of Solomon in parallel also. And there's a mutuality there in the way they talk about it and the way they quote those books. There's another mutuality here that's also worth talking about. This one's understated. It's not explicit in the text, but it's worth coming into for a minute. In the Western tradition, it's really common. I mean, it comes hard after Galileo that there's really kind of like two books. There's the book of nature, and then there's God's revealed word, the scriptures.
Sure.
And God's findable in both. And you can kind of imagine how someone who is infused with the Holy Spirit, who's pursuing wisdom, can go out and find God in nature more easily than anyone else,
Yeah.
because they have that enlightenment that's coming from wisdom itself. And if we go back into the book of wisdom and those passages earlier from the books of the Kings, we see that there is this idea that wisdom illumines nature, so that there is
Mhm.
a kind of awareness of nature that is only available with wisdom. So you have now here in the argument this mutuality happening, where
Mhm.
God is saying that we find God through nature, but we only understand nature with God. And in other words, it takes the scriptures or wisdom revealed by other means to illumine the book of nature for us, to interpret the book of nature for us. And it also takes the book of nature for us to fully experience God. We end up finding them both at the same time in the same way through God's intervention in our lives as we pursue wisdom. Enough of this got close but no cigar part here in the book, where God's approachable through nature, but people can't quite get over the threshold. Let's now talk about what happens on the other way people miss, which is the real sin, the one that the author is really driving at, which is to say, if the other one was the small order of bad fries, this is the biggie size
Sure.
order of bad fries, right? And that's graven images. In
Yeah.
other words, like, if you kind of imagine that there's a stirring behind a leaf and that's just the spirits moving something, well, that might be a little bit forgivable, like he says.
Sure.
But if you go ahead and like make yourself a statue of the little nymph that supposedly moved that leaf, you're into trouble
Yeah.
now.
Well,
Bigger trouble.
totally. And I think that's one of the reasons why you can almost detect some irony. The tone here has at times a little bit of kind of an amusing character. Um,
You might
it's
even say sharp. I mean, he gets kind of snarky. We'll
he
get into the
does.
snark in a minute.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, he's not suggesting that idolatry shouldn't be taken seriously. Like, it's not a laughing matter in that sense. He actually does think that 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 idolatry closes us off in some sense to
Mm-hmm.
God's work in us. And I, at least from a Christian standpoint, we would also say it opens us up to demonic influence.
Yeah.
And so it is to be shunned, but does that mean we don't laugh in the process? Does that mean we don't take some time to ridicule? It seems when you read the Old Testament, there is a great tradition of ridiculing the idols and mocking the false gods.
Well, I mean, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, when he asks, like, where is he? Is he taking
Yeah.
a dump? I mean,
It's quite
it's kind
colorful.
of it's kind of hard to imagine, actually, that like scatological humor coming in, but like
Yeah.
it's right there. And the reason for it is the what the authors are saying here, whether it's whether it's in the Old Testament or in the kind of pivotal stage here that we find in the Wisdom of Solomon, is that there is something ridiculous
Mhm.
about idol worship, and therefore it bears ridicule.
Yeah. And there's a couple things that we should, maybe highlight real fast
Hmm.
that might seem foreign to us in our culture. But in the day that this was written, I mean, people would have known of the worship of kings.
Hmm.
They would have known of the worship of conquerors. Even Augustus Caesar. This is a divine title.
Right.
One
Yeah.
one of the terms, I don't have the verse reference in front of me, unfortunately, but one of the terms here in the text itself, the Greek term that's used is a similar term for worship. Is a term that becomes Augustus for
Hmm.
Caesar. So they would have already known that this was a thing,
Yeah.
and they would have seen it around them. Also, something that I thought was curious was in chapter 14, verse 15, it talked about a father who was grieved at the death of his child. And so he then sets up this statue of his child that had been suddenly taken from him.
Hmm.
Well, there's a note in the Lutheran Annotated Apocrypha that said that figurines or statues crafted in memory of a lost child may have reflected a belief that the spirit of the deceased child continued in the household, watching over the family members. And this note goes on to say that this statue may have even been passed down to generations and become this revered part of the family cult.
Yeah. Back then, families did have that, right? There was
Yeah,
like a fire that the family would keep. There was a panoply of deities that they would give allegiance to, appeal
right,
to, and those would be represented in little statues that they would basically keep in a family altar. And that
right.
idea that you would be maintaining that was part of your quote unquote religion.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and they were surrounded by these idols too. I mean, there were places where there'd be, little shrines on the corner and
Yeah.
things like that. So it was quite a different world than we're used to seeing. Our idolatry takes on many different forms. Some of them may overlap with this in certain aspects of society, but for the most part, this stuff is kind of hidden from our view. So it may not be as clear to us as it would have been for the early readers.
Yeah.
They would have seen this and been like, "Oh yeah, I just passed 5 idols today on my way to the bakery." You know,
Right.
it was everywhere.
Well, including, by the way, the meat that you bought from the butcher next door, because that was meat sacrificed to
Yeah,
idols, right?
and that became quite a problem for the early church.
Yeah. So this was endemic. This was everywhere. And as the author here is slinging his machete through these cultural traditions, he's not talking about something that would be foreign to any of his readers. They would
Right.
all know exactly what he's talking about, which is why he's able to be so free and even a little bit jocular with it. So, like, if you look at the chapter 13, verses 17 through 19, there is a reference to the kinds of things that people pray for:
Hmm.
possessions, marriage, children, health, life, aid, travel, safety during travel, money making, strength. And yet, what's funny is this idol that they are praying to can't do anything for them at all.
Yeah.
Right down to this point, he says, as a person fashions an idol for themselves, it says that he makes a suitable niche for it in the wall, and he fastens it there with iron. Like he makes sure that
Sure.
it can't fall. Why? Because it can't help itself, it says.
Yeah. Right.
It is only an image and has need of help. So then he says, so what is it? If this thing needs your help, why are you asking it for help?
Yeah.
And we all know at some level that pagans are savvier than that. They're not praying to a
Right.
tiny statue, thinking this tiny statue can do anything. Yet at the same time, they are praying to spiritual powers
Yeah.
that the author says are basically helpless. If those spiritual powers could take care of themselves, they wouldn't need you to fashion an idol for them and affix it to your wall so that it couldn't fall over.
Right. Well, and it was interesting because there is this sense in which many of the people in the day that this was written thought that somehow the gods inhabited rocks or metals or different
Mm-hmm.
things like that. But that wouldn't stop them from refashioning. If I was reading that if they had an idol that was there in silver and they needed the silver, they could simply fashion one out of copper and then use the silver. So it wasn't even like this idol itself was ultimately sacred.
This is what happens in an inflationary economy. You go to that bakery, bread costs more. Well, rip a finger off of Zeus. It's time to melt it down.
That's exactly it. That'll really connects with today too.
Totally, yeah. So there is a funny line here actually about this very thing. He says, "One preparing to sail and about to voyage over raging waves calls upon a piece of wood more fragile than the ship that carries him."
Yeah.
And it's like zing. It's
Yeah.
it's a slam.
Totally. Well, what was cool about this? I did a little bit of a Google search on it, and it was very common for this to happen. For them to have these statues on the front of their ship, and there were particular statues. It was Castor and Pollux, if I'm saying that correctly. These are figures in Greek and Roman mythology, and their statues would often be placed on a ship. So, like if you do a Google image search, you can actually see some really cool sketches of what some of these ships would have looked like. But these were essentially figureheads with their horses on the front, the whole nine, and they're looking to these things almost like a talisman or some sort of good luck charm or whatever to connect them to these idols, to these gods. Well, even look at what St. Paul's ship had. Acts chapter 28, verse 11 says, "After 3 months we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship with the figurehead of the twin gods, Castor and Pollux." So right here, St. Paul is even writing on one of these ships. He's certainly not participating in the idolatry. This was a vessel he was on. It seems obvious to us that placing these idols on the front of the ship is not going to get you there. And it certainly didn't do much for St. Paul in his mind. But that does open up the question, is there a sense in which wood plays a role in our safety and salvation?
What's cool about this, well, there's a lot of things that are cool about it, but here's another thing that's cool about it. If you go down, we're in chapter 14 right now, right? So if you jump down to verse 6, it talks about boats again, but this is a different boat. It talks about the ark. And it says here, "For even in the beginning, when the arrogant giants were perishing," and by the way, when I say the arrogant giants were perishing, what I'm really saying is, call Father Stephen DeYoung, because this is his territory. This is his territory. He knows what's going on here. This is the giants. These are the titans, right? These are this is the bad stuff from way back in Genesis that gets reinterpreted in ways that sound a lot safer and cleaner and easier to manage than what's really here. It says, "When the arrogant giants were perishing, the hope of the world took refuge on a raft." He's, downplaying the size of this thing a little bit. "And guided by your hand, left to the world the seed of a new generation. For blessed is the wood by which righteousness comes." So he's saying, while these pagans are praying to their idols of Castor and Pollux, while they're praying to the little idols that are supposedly going to bring them to safety, the real Lord of the universe, the real maker of those waves, those dangerous waves, led people through on a fragile ark, like to restore the population of the world. In other words, God is the one to whom you should be praying, not the idol on the front of the boat.
Yeah, and what's the significance of Noah's Ark, right? I think it's called a raft here because it's not a boat you navigate. Like there's no rudder, there's nothing to catch the wind. The ark was designed to simply hold, float, and save.
Right.
So even in the midst of this, major judgment, God provides a way for humanity to get through that judgment and to survive. And it's also notable, I hope I'm not jumping ahead too far, but I want to draw a connection here in how Christians have often seen Noah's Ark and how they would look at this text in particular, because what idols can't do, God can do, and this wood here is used to make an amazing contrast. under the influence of the writings of St. Paul, particularly in Galatians chapter 3, St. Paul talks about the crucifixion of Christ on the wood of the cross as the cause of our salvation.
Mm-hmm.
And I love how St. Theodore the Studite puts it. He says, in the beginning, death came into the world through the wood of a tree. Now a tree, the cross, gives us life. Where once we were seduced by the power of a tree, now the old enemy, the serpent, is driven out by the power of the cross. There have been new and unexpected changes. We're given life instead of death, immortality instead of corruption, glory instead of dishonor. The Christians saw in the episode of the ark, they saw a figure of baptism, which is itself seen as a participation in the death of Christ. So it's totally natural to connect the wood of the cross and the wood of Noah's ark for the Christians, and then to set that over against the idolatrous wood that cannot save.
Well, exactly. I dare you, as a believer in Jesus Christ, to read this line, verse 7, for blessed is the wood by which righteousness comes, any other way than as an icon, a prefiguration of the cross.
That's
Like,
exactly
if
right.
you're a Christian reader, that's how you're going to read that.
Yeah.
Especially, by the way, if you're not, shall we uncharitably perhaps say, kind of blinded by modern critical scholarship. Instead of seeing that as a tool, using that as your total lens, you're going to miss these kind of patristic ways of reading the texts. The fathers totally read that as a picture of the cross. There's an interesting passage here in chapter 14, verse 11. It says this, therefore, there will be a visitation also upon the heathen idols. And that word visitation, it can mean several things. You know, like we think about judgment being visited, which automatically opens up this idea that there's an inquiry being made, that there is an investigation underway. And you kind of have this idea of the Lord basically bringing an indictment against these heathen idols. It's like he's the grand jury and he's coming down with an indictment. And that indictment is because they became an abomination, snares for human souls, and a trap for the feet of the foolish. And that's heavy duty, right? That's bad news. It's sort of like God has created man to love him, to have a relationship with him, and these evil forces that are at loose in the world that are manifest through the devil. We talked about death coming into the world through the envy of the devil. Well, here's how that envy gets manifest. It gets manifest in idolatry, which then ensnares humans. And so God is not happy about this. This is God bringing judgment now on idolatry precisely because it thwarts his original vision for humanity. All right, Jamie, here's a weird one.
Okay.
What does it mean to say, as it says in verse 12 of chapter 14, that idolatry is the beginning of fornication?
Well, let's start with the obvious. I think there's spiritual harlotry going on here. Like abandoning the path of God is certainly a form of spiritual adultery. It's cheating on God in a very real sense. But I think the text is saying more than that. The chapter goes on to say a lot of things. It lists quite a few things that idolatry arguably leads to.
Yeah.
If you jump down to verse 22 and following, you actually find a whole bunch of stuff unpacked. Calls great evils peace. Kill children in their initiations. No longer keep either their lives or their marriages pure. Treacherously kill one another. Grieve one another by idolatry. So we got like idols upon idols here. You can't help but also think of St. Paul in Romans 3. There's none who does good. No, not one. All have turned aside. Like he's just heaping things on where he's saying idolatry, this path leads to all of this madness. And so as I reflected on this issue, I thought, well, if idolatry is a violation of the first part of God's law, traditionally we talk about the two tables of God's law. The first table being our duties to God, the second table being our duties to man in the Ten Commandments. Well, unfaithfulness to God is often seen as unfaithfulness towards others. So if you break the first commandment, it's almost like you've broken them all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's why verse 27 says, the worship of idols is the beginning and cause and end of every evil. So verse 12 does start out saying it's the beginning of fornication, but then it just gets like the rest of the chapter is just, well, fornication and this and this and this and this.
It's like that's when he starts blowing the balloon and the circumference of this thing just keeps growing and growing and growing.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, right up until it pops, which is what is happening in this passage, because he's basically saying all hell breaks loose because of idolatry.
Right.
That line about murdering children, like that's a stunning one when you see it and you're
really
like,
is.
nah, that couldn't be, right? But we already know that the Canaanites were like cannibals based on what it says here in the Wisdom of Solomon.
Yeah.
And you find here like this reference to killing children in their initiations, in their like secret cults. And I was checking David Winston's commentary on the Wisdom of Solomon from the Anchor Bible series, and he actually references a couple of specific cults that did this, where the killing of a child was part of the actual worship ceremony. It was part of the thing. Let me just read this from David Winston. Ino, Dionysius's mother's sister, is said to have killed her own infant son, Melicertes, in a fit of madness. This son of Ino's was worshipped on the island of Tenedos as Palimon, and since children were sacrificed to him, he was called the child killer. I don't even know what you do with that other than just to like scratch your head and I don't know, and grieve. Like, how could that even be? But there it is.
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing the madness that we can all descend into when we don't follow wisdom, when we don't follow God, and when we don't follow a healthy mental life. I think of our current times, and if you spend any time on Netflix or Hulu these days, more and more shows are coming out that have absolute brutality and murder as the key storyline, and it's the villain or the anti-hero comes to the forefront. And this kind of madness is not, limited to the ancient world, nor is it limited to our time, nor does Netflix make us somehow, magically the worst of the worst. Rather, this kind of darkness can certainly enter into the human heart. And, really in the end, I think the message here is that it's God's justice that prevails over the evil behavior of humanity and over the false worship that leads us to that behavior.
And let me just say this in advance. So I beg your indulgence, listener, Jamie, also.
Uh-oh.
But if you want a comparison of what's happening here in this book and in this passage in particular, you really have to go no further than the jazz scene of the 1960s and the hip hop scene of the late 80s.
Okay.
Why would I say this?
I don't know, but you're singing my tune.
Growing up, I listened to an awful lot of hip hop. You still do listen to an awful lot of hip hop.
Sure
I still listen to it. I still listen to it when it floats my boat. But when I was growing up, one album that was huge at the time was Tone Loc's "Loke It After Dark," and this album was everywhere, and it was everywhere for really one particular reason. There were a few songs on it that were really big, but one of them was very big, and that was "Funky Cold Medina." I'm not going to go into that
Yikes.
song. Let's
Yeah.
just say that when in the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 14, verses 22 through 31, when it's kind of getting at all hell's breaking loose, what's going on Tone Loc's album is an example of that. Okay, this is a manifestation of that. And here's the twist. Here's what's interesting. The album cover for that record shows Tone Loc leaning over the hood of a Jaguar. And it's a killer image.
Sure.
It's a great
Yeah.
picture.
Yeah.
You see that, it's very iconic. It's a quote. It's a visual quote. Because Donald Byrd in 1964 released a jazz album called New Perspective.
Okay.
And A New Perspective was Donald Byrd's is a trumpet player, and really incredible trumpet player. I spend actually much more time these days listening to jazz than I do hip hop. But this album has the same cover shot, almost identical. What Tone Loc is doing is actually copying. He's quoting that cover, and he's quoting that cover to project his vision of life, of cool, of all that stuff. But Donald Byrd's picture of life, of cool and all that stuff is much, much different. Because if you go back and you listen to A New Perspective, it's a gospel album, right down to the choruses and the whole thing. I think that these two albums, it's a stretch, but come on. I think these two albums are actually pictures of what this book is getting at. There's true worship, which is what Donald Byrd is giving us in A New Perspective. And then there is the twisted version of it, which is what Tone Loc is giving us in Loc It After Dark. Wow. And what I find fascinating about that is that's the very same argument the author of the Wisdom of Solomon gives. Not that idolatry is original, but that it's derivative. Not that idolatry is true or based on reality in the sense of that it comes from what's true and comes from reality. No, it's a sham. It's a quote of the original, and more to the point, it's a misquote of the original. And so while it's a bit of an interpretive leap to go ahead and put those two albums in parallel to each other in relationship to a book like the Wisdom of Solomon, it's not that much of a stretch. What those two albums are actually saying is the exact same thing that the Wisdom of Solomon is saying.
Well, I think that's about it for today. We've been having a great time studying this book with you. If you're enjoying what you hear, please check out badbooksofthebible.com and share with a friend. You can also shoot us an email from that page. It's right down at the bottom. We'll be covering some question and answers in future episodes, and we'd love to have your questions. I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when we get more of the same.